The crisp London morning air carried the sound of hundreds of footsteps as tourists from around the world gathered in the expansive courtyard of Buckingham Palace. The ancient cobblestones, worn smooth by centuries of ceremonial processions, reflected the golden rays of the early sun that cast dramatic shadows across the historic grounds. Among the diverse crowd of excited visitors stood Margaret Whitfield, 52-year-old businesswoman from Manhattan's Upper East Side, her presence commanding attention even in the sea of people. Margaret was not just any tourist. She owned a successful marketing firm that catered to luxury brands, and her personal wealth was evident in every detail of her appearance. Her Italian leather handbag, worth more than most people's monthly salary, hung perfectly positioned on her forearm. The diamond bracelet on her wrist caught the sunlight as she adjusted her state-of-the-art camera equipment, worth nearly $10,000. She had flown first class from New York specifically for this moment, spending more on her 3-day London trip than many families spent on entire vacations. Margaret had always lived by a simple philosophy that had served her well in business. In life, money talks, and those who have it deserve special treatment. She expected doors to open for her, lines to part, and people to accommodate her wishes without question. This mindset had rarely failed her in the corporate world of New York, where wealth and influence were respected currencies. She saw no reason why London should be any different. Her perfectly manicured nails, painted in an expensive French manicure, tapped impatiently against her phone as she surveyed the crowd around her. She had specifically booked the most expensive guided tour package available, one that promised exclusive access and the best viewing positions for the changing of the guard ceremony. The tour guide, a nervous young man named Timothy, had already felt the sharp edge of Margaret's tongue when he suggested that all tourists, regardless of what they paid, needed to follow the same safety protocols. The royal guards stood like statues in their magnificent scarlet uniforms, each thread of their wool tunics representing centuries of British military tradition. Their tall bearskin caps, made from the fur of Canadian black bears, added an imposing 8 inches to their already impressive stature. These were not costume performers or actors hired for tourist entertainment. They were active-duty soldiers from elite regiments, men who had undergone rigorous selection processes and extensive training to earn the honor of protecting the British royal family. Each guard carried a rifle with a fixed bayonet, and despite their ceremonial appearance, they were fully trained warriors capable of defending the palace against any threat. Their iconic uniforms were not just for show. They were the same designs worn by soldiers who had fought in battles across the British Empire for over 3 centuries. Guard James Mitchell stood at his designated position, his back ramrod straight, and his eyes focused ahead with laser precision. At 28 years old, he was a decorated soldier who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before being selected for this prestigious assignment. The selection process had been grueling, testing not just his physical capabilities but his mental fortitude and unshakable discipline. Only soldiers with spotless records and exceptional self-control were chosen to represent the crown in this capacity. James took immense pride in his role, understanding that he was not just a guard, but a living symbol of British heritage and military excellence. Every morning when he donned his uniform, he felt the weight of history on his shoulders. He represented not just himself or his regiment, but centuries of soldiers who had stood in similar positions, protecting the monarchy through wars, political upheavals, and countless changes in the world around them. The discipline required for this position was extraordinary. Guards were expected to remain motionless for hours, regardless of weather conditions, physical discomfort, or distractions from tourists. They had been trained to ignore everything from crying babies to deliberate attempts by visitors to make them laugh or react. James had mastered this skill over 3 years of service, developing an almost supernatural ability to remain focused. And still, while maintaining complete awareness of his surroundings, Margaret's sharp eyes immediately identified James as the perfect subject for her photograph. His position offered an ideal angle for the dramatic shot she envisioned, one that would dominate her social media feeds and make her friends envious of her London adventure. However, her view was obstructed by a large family from Germany, who were taking turns posing for pictures at a respectful distance from the guards. The German family consisted of parents and 3 young children, all dressed modestly and behaving with appropriate reverence for the ceremony they were witnessing. The father was patiently explaining to his children the historical significance of the guards, while his wife organized their photos. They represented everything that responsible tourism should be: respectful, educational, and mindful of local customs and rules. But Margaret had no patience for such considerations. She began pushing through the crowd with increasing aggression, using her expensive handbag as a wedge to create space. Her movements were deliberately forceful, causing other tourists to stumble and apologize even though they had done nothing wrong. Her entitled attitude created a bubble of tension around her as people instinctively moved away from her aggressive energy. "Excuse me, but some of us paid premium prices for this experience," she announced loudly to no one in particular, her voice carrying a sharp edge that made nearby tourists uncomfortable. The German family glanced at her with confusion and mild concern. I'm sure why this well-dressed woman seemed so angry about a situation that was perfectly pleasant for everyone else. Timothy, her tour guide, approached nervously. He had been doing this job for 2 years and had dealt with difficult customers before. But Margaret's demanding nature was testing his professional limits. "Mrs. Whitfield, I understand you want the best photos, but we do need to respect the barriers and other visitors," he said diplomatically, hoping to defuse the situation before it escalated. Margaret turned on him with blazing eyes. "I didn't pay £3,000 for this tour to be lectured about barriers by someone half my age. I expect you to ensure I get what I paid for, which includes unobstructed access to photograph these guards." Her voice carried across the courtyard, drawing stares from other tourists who were beginning to recognize that something unpleasant was developing as Margaret studied James more intently. A calculating expression crossed her face. She'd heard stories and read articles about the legendary discipline of the Queen's Guard. How they never broke character, no matter what tourists did to try to get their attention. Some articles had described tourists making faces, telling jokes, or even staging minor scenes to try to make the guards react. All without success. A dangerous idea began forming in Margaret's mind. If these guards were truly as disciplined as everyone claimed, then perhaps she could create something far more dramatic than a simple photograph. Perhaps she could stage something that would generate the kind of viral social media content that money couldn't buy. Her business instincts told her that authentic, dramatic content was worth its weight in gold in today's digital marketplace. Other tourists continued to take their pictures from appropriate distances, their faces filled with wonder and respect for the ceremony they were witnessing. Children pointed in amazement at the colorful uniforms, while their parents explained the historical significance of the tradition. The atmosphere should have been one of shared appreciation for British culture and history. But Margaret was no longer seeing the scene through the lens of cultural appreciation. In her entitled mindset, she had reduced James from a dedicated soldier performing an honored duty to nothing more than a prop in her personal performance. The respect and dignity that the ceremony was designed to inspire had been replaced in her mind by an opportunity for self-promotion and attention-seeking behavior. She began to move closer to James, her expensive camera at the ready, completely unaware that she was about to cross lines that would change everything for both of them. Margaret's movements became increasingly aggressive as she maneuvered through the crowd, using her sharp elbows and expensive handbag as weapons to create space around James's position. Her behavior was drawing uncomfortable stares from fellow tourists, many of whom had traveled thousands of miles to respectfully witness this centuries-old tradition. The contrast between their reverent attitudes and her entitled aggression was becoming impossible to ignore. She stepped deliberately over the rope barriers that had been carefully positioned to maintain appropriate distances between visitors and the working guards. These barriers weren't arbitrary decorations. They represented serious security protocols. The ropes marked the minimum safe distance required for the guards to perform their duties effectively while ensuring that visitors could still enjoy the ceremony. A palace security officer named Robert Thompson, a veteran with 15 years of experience managing tourist interactions, immediately noticed Margaret's violation. He had seen thousands of visitors over the years, and he could identify potential troublemakers with remarkable accuracy. Margaret's body language, her dismissive attitude toward other tourists, and her blatant disregard for posted rules sent up immediate red flags in his trained mind. "Excuse me, ma'am," Robert called out in a firm but polite voice, approaching her with the professional demeanor he had perfected over years of dealing with difficult visitors. "You need to step back behind the barrier immediately. These boundaries are in place for everyone's safety and to allow the guards to perform their duties." Margaret didn't even turn around to acknowledge him. She was too focused on positioning herself at the perfect angle to capture James in her photograph. Her expensive camera made continuous clicking sounds as she took shot after shot each time. Moving incrementally closer to the stoic guard, she treated Robert's authority with the same dismissive attitude she used with anyone she considered beneath her. Social status. The other tourists were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the developing situation. A British family with 2 teenage daughters moved further away, the father whispering to his wife about ugly American behavior. An elderly Japanese couple who had saved for years to make this trip looked genuinely distressed that someone would show such disrespect in a place they considered sacred. Their disapproval was evident in their facial expressions and whispered comments to each other. James could sense Margaret's presence in his peripheral vision, but his extensive training kept him perfectly motionless. He had dealt with challenging tourists before, people who tried to make him laugh, tourists who attempted to distract him with outrageous behavior, and visitors who seemed to think the guards were performers rather than active duty soldiers. However, something about Margaret's aggressive energy was different from anything he had previously encountered. His training had prepared him. He had learned to ignore crying babies, loud tour groups, and even occasional mild physical contact from tourists who didn't understand appropriate boundaries. But the intensity of Margaret's focus on him, combined with her obvious disregard for authority figures, created a tension he had never felt during his 3 years of service. Margaret's frustration was mounting exponentially. His perfect stillness. She had expected at least some minor acknowledgement of her presence, perhaps a slight movement, or a barely perceptible shift in posture. The complete absence of any reaction was infuriating her entitled personality, which was accustomed to commanding attention and receiving immediate responses to her demands. "Can't you at least look at the camera?" she said loudly enough for nearby tourists to hear clearly. Her voice carried a sharp, demanding tone that made several visitors visibly cringe. "I'm trying to get a decent photograph here and you're being completely uncooperative." A group of university students from France began quietly recording the scene with their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something highly unusual and potentially significant. They had studied British culture in their classes and understood that what they were seeing represented a serious breach of protocol and respect. Robert approached Margaret again, this time with greater urgency in his voice and posture. His years of experience told him that situations like this could escalate quickly if not handled decisively. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again. You must return to the designated viewing area immediately. You're violating multiple palace protocols, and your behavior is disrupting the ceremony for other visitors." Margaret spun around to face him with an expression of pure indignation that would have been comical if the situation weren't becoming so serious. Her face was flushed red with anger, and her voice reached a pitch that carried clearly across the entire courtyard. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to? I'm a successful businesswoman from New York City. I've spent more money on this trip than you probably make in 6 months. I have every right to take photographs at a public ceremony." Her outburst drew even more attention from the growing crowd of tourists. Many of them began openly recording the confrontation with their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would likely become viral content on social media. The irony was lost on Margaret that she was indeed creating the kind of memorable content she had wanted, but not in the way she had intended. "Yes, ma'am, this is a public ceremony," Robert replied with professional patience, though his jaw was tightening with controlled frustration. However, it's still conducted on royal property with established rules that apply to everyone equally, regardless of their nationality or economic status. The barriers exist for important security and operational reasons. Margaret's business success had come largely from her ability to intimidate people and bulldoze through obstacles that might stop others. She had built her career on the assumption that persistence and aggressive behavior would eventually wear down any opposition. She simply could not accept that there were situations where her usual tactics would not work. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she declared loudly, her voice echoing off the palace walls. "All he's doing is standing there like some kind of decoration. It's not like I'm interrupting a real military operation or anything important. These guards are just tourist attractions, aren't they?" Her words hit James like physical blows. Suggestion that his service was merely decorative, that his dedication and sacrifice were nothing more than entertainment for visitors, struck at the core of his professional pride and personal identity. Every muscle in his body wanted to respond, to defend himself and his fellow guards. But his training held him in place. The crowd's reaction to Margaret's words was immediate and negative. Gasps of disapproval came from multiple directions, and the British tourists in particular seemed personally offended by her dismissive attitude toward their national institutions. The atmosphere in the courtyard had shifted from curiosity about the confrontation to genuine anger at Margaret's behavior. A middle-aged woman from Liverpool stepped forward, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had reached her. "Limit? That's a serving soldier you're talking about, love. It's not a decoration or a tourist attraction." Her entitled mindset had been challenged, her authority questioned, and her desires thwarted. In her warped perspective, everyone around her was conspiring to deny her the special treatment she believed she deserved. The stage was set for her to make a decision that would change everything. The tension in the courtyard was palpable as dozens of tourists watched to see what would happen next. James remained perfectly still, but inside he was preparing himself for whatever might come. His years of military training creating a heightened state of awareness that most civilians could never understand. Robert Thompson's 15 years of experience in palace security had taught him to recognize when a situation was approaching a critical tipping point. Margaret's escalating aggression, combined with her complete disregard for authority and growing, the audience of recording tourists created a perfect storm that could result in serious consequences for everyone involved. His professional instincts told him that this confrontation was about to cross lines that couldn't be uncrossed. "Ma'am," Robert said with the firm authority of someone who had dealt with thousands of difficult situations, "I am giving you one final warning. You must step back behind the designated barriers immediately and maintain appropriate distance from the guards. If you refuse to comply, I will have no choice but to remove you from the palace grounds entirely." The weight of his words should have penetrated Margaret's entitled bubble, but she was now operating on pure rage and wounded pride. Her successful business career had been built on never backing down, never accepting defeat, and always finding a way to get what she wanted. The concept that there might be situations where her usual tactics would fail was completely foreign to her. Worldview. Margaret's face contorted with an expression of pure fury that made several nearby tourists instinctively step backward. Her expensive makeup was beginning to show stress cracks, and her perfectly styled hair was becoming disheveled from her increasingly agitated movements. "This is completely unacceptable. I didn't fly 3,000 miles and spend a fortune to be treated like some common criminal by palace rent-a-cops." The crowd of tourists had swelled to nearly 100 people, forming a rough semicircle around the unfolding drama. Many of them were actively recording with their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. The videos they were capturing would soon spread across social media platforms worldwide. Though Margaret remained oblivious to this fact in her rage-focused tunnel vision, James maintained his perfect military bearing. But internally, he was processing the escalating situation. With the heightened awareness that comes from combat training, his peripheral vision tracked Margaret's increasingly erratic movements, while his ears picked up the growing murmur of disapproval from the crowd. Every instinct honed by years of military service was telling him to prepare for potential physical confrontation. The other guards positioned around the courtyard remained in their ceremonial positions, but James could sense their increased alertness. They were all highly trained soldiers who understood that their colleague was facing a situation that could quickly become dangerous. Their training included protocols for supporting each other if civilian interactions became threatening or violent. Margaret looked around at the crowd of tourists, expecting to find support or at least sympathy for her position. Instead, she saw faces filled with disapproval, disgust, and genuine anger at her behavior. British tourists in particular seemed personally offended by her disrespectful treatment of their national symbols and traditions. An elderly gentleman, wearing a Royal Navy veteran's pin, stepped forward with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His voice carried the authority of decades of military service. "Young lady, that soldier has served his country with honor and distinction. Your behavior is a disgrace to whatever country you represent." Rather than being chastened by this moral authority, Margaret's anger reached new heights. The combination of public humiliation, thwarted desires, and wounded pride created a toxic mixture that overwhelmed whatever rational thinking she might have possessed. In her distorted perspective, everyone around her was conspiring to deny her the respect and accommodation she believed she deserved. "I don't need lectures from strangers about respect." She snapped at the veteran, her voice reaching a shrill pitch that made several children in the crowd begin crying. "I'm the customer here, and the customer is always right. These guards work for the government, which means they work for taxpayers like me." Her fundamental misunderstanding of the guard's role, the nature of British government, and basic principles of human decency was becoming more apparent with every word she spoke. The crowd's reaction shifted from mere disapproval to genuine outrage at her ignorance and arrogance. James felt something shift inside him as he listened to Margaret's increasingly offensive statements. 3 years of dealing with difficult tourists had taught him patience. But her attacks on his service, his country, and his fellow veterans were testing limits he didn't know he had. Still, his training held him in place, though the tension in his jaw and the slight tightening around his eyes would have been visible to anyone looking closely. In her mounting frustration and sense of powerlessness, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She had built her entire adult life around the belief that aggressive action could overcome any obstacle. When negotiation failed in business, she applied pressure. When pressure failed, she escalated further. This approach had worked for decades, in corporate boardrooms and high society social situations, but Buckingham Palace was not a corporate boardroom, and James Mitchell was not a business rival who could be intimidated into submission. Margaret was about to learn that some boundaries cannot be crossed without serious consequences. She stared directly at James, her eyes blazing with fury and entitled indignation. In her distorted thinking, he had become the symbol of everything that was thwarting her will. His perfect stillness and professional dignity were personal insults to her sense of importance and power. "Maybe this will get your attention," she muttered, her words carrying clearly in the sudden hush that had fallen over the courtyard. The crowd sensed that something significant was about to happen, and conversations died away as hundreds of people focused their attention on the confrontation. Without warning or further consideration of consequences, Margaret reached out with her right hand and gave James a sharp, deliberate push on his left shoulder. The physical contact was unmistakable, not accidental, not incidental, but a clear and intentional assault on a member of the Queen's Guard. While he was performing his official duties, the moment her hand made contact with James's uniform, a collective gasp rose from the crowd that could be heard throughout the entire courtyard. The sound was like air being sucked from the space as hundreds of people realized simultaneously that they had just witnessed something unprecedented and serious. Phones and cameras that had been recording casually suddenly focused with laser intensity on Margaret and James. Every tourist in the area understood instinctively that they were now documenting evidence of what appeared to be a criminal act against a representative of the British Crown. James felt the push, but his military training and physical conditioning kept him steady on his feet. However, something fundamental changed in that moment. For 3 years, he had maintained perfect discipline while dealing with every conceivable form of tourist behavior. But physical assault crossed a line that even his extensive training had not fully prepared him to handle. Margaret stood there for a moment, apparently shocked by her own action. Some part of her mind seemed to realize that she had just done something irreversible, something that couldn't be taken back or laughed off as a misunderstanding. But her pride and entitled worldview prevented her from immediately recognizing The gravity of what had just occurred, the silence in the courtyard, was deafening as hundreds of people waited to see what would happen next. Robert Thompson was already moving toward Margaret, his hand reaching for his radio to call for additional security support. The other guards remained in position, but their alertness had reached maximum levels. James took a slow, measured breath, as his mind processed what had just happened and rapidly calculated his response options. Years of military training, months of specialized guard preparation, and decades of personal integrity were about to converge in a moment that would define both his career and Margaret's immediate future. What happened next sent shockwaves through the entire courtyard and would be replayed millions of times on social media platforms around the world. James Mitchell, after 3 years of maintaining perfect ceremonial stillness through every conceivable distraction, suddenly came to life with the precise movements of a highly trained soldier responding to a direct threat. He executed a perfect about-face turn, his movements sharp and military precise until he was facing Margaret directly. His eyes, which had been focused on the distance for hours, now locked onto hers with an intensity that made her take an involuntary step backward. When he spoke, his voice carried the full authority of his military rank and the weight of centuries. "Of British military tradition," Madam James announced in a clear, commanding voice that could be heard throughout the entire courtyard. "You have just committed assault upon a member of Her Majesty's Guard while on active duty. Under the authority granted to me as a serving soldier of the Crown, I am placing you under citizen's arrest pending the arrival of the Metropolitan Police. The transformation from motionless ceremonial guard to authoritative military officer was so dramatic and immediate that many tourists gasped audibly. Margaret's mouth fell open in complete shock as she realized that the decoration she had been tormenting was actually a highly trained soldier with real authority and the willingness to use it. "You cannot be serious," Margaret sputtered, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief, anger, and dawning fear. It was barely a touch. "You're completely overreacting to nothing. I'm an American citizen, and you have no right to detain me." James maintained his military bearing while addressing her claims with the precision of someone who knew exactly what laws applied to the situation. "Ma'am, under British law, any unwanted physical contact constitutes assault, regardless of the force used. The fact that this assault was committed against a member of the armed forces while performing official duties makes it a particularly serious offense. Your nationality is irrelevant when you commit crimes on British soil." The crowd of tourists had grown to several hundred people, creating a human amphitheater around the confrontation. Every phone and camera in sight was recording the exchange, capturing Margaret's shocked expressions and James's professional handling of the situation. Many tourists were already uploading clips to social media with captions expressing their amazement at what they were witnessing. Robert Thompson approached the scene with backup security officers who had responded to his radio call. Both relieved that James had taken control of the situation and impressed by the guards' professional handling of an unprecedented crisis. "The Metropolitan Police have been contacted and are en route," he informed James. "Estimated arrival time is less than 5 minutes." Margaret's panic was becoming more evident by the second as the reality of her situation began to penetrate her entitled worldview. She looked around frantically at the crowd of tourists, hoping to find support or sympathy, but saw only faces filled with disapproval and active phone cameras documenting her humiliation. "This is completely insane," she declared, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch that made several small children in the crowd begin crying. "All I did was try to get a decent photograph. You people are treating me like some kind of terrorist. I demand to speak to the American Embassy immediately." James remained calm and professional in his response, his military training allowing him to handle her emotional outburst with complete composure. "Ma'am, you will have the opportunity to contact your embassy once you have been processed by the police. However, as I stated, your nationality does not exempt you from British law. Assault is assault, regardless of your stated intentions." A British Army veteran in the crowd stepped forward, his voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had served alongside soldiers like James. "Young man, you've handled this situation with remarkable professionalism." This woman needed to learn that actions have consequences, and you've taught that lesson with perfect military bearing." Other voices from the crowd began expressing support for James's actions. "About time someone stood up to tourists like this," called out a middle-aged British woman. "These guards deserve respect, not abuse." Margaret realized that the crowd was completely against her, and her panic began transforming into desperate anger. "I can pay whatever fine you want."
How much?
"Money? Do you need to make this go away? I'm wealthy, and I can compensate everyone involved." Her attempt to bribe her way out of the situation only made things worse, as several tourists began openly laughing at her assumption that money could solve what she had created. James's expression hardened slightly as he addressed her inappropriate suggestion. "Ma'am, attempting to bribe a member of the armed forces is another serious offense under British law. I strongly advise you to remain silent until legal counsel can be provided for you." The sound of approaching sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder with each passing moment. Margaret's face went pale as she began to understand that this was not going to be resolved with money, threats, or entitled behavior. She was actually going to face real legal consequences for her actions. Timothy, her tour guide, approached nervously, with other members of their tour group trailing behind him. His face showed a mixture of professional embarrassment and personal mortification at being associated with Margaret's behavior. "Mrs. Whitfield, I think it would be best if you remained quiet and cooperated fully with the authorities." "Don't you dare lecture me," Margaret snapped at him. "You're supposed to be working for me. I expect you to support your clients, not side with these people who are persecuting me." Timothy stepped back, clearly wanting to distance himself as much as possible from Margaret and her legal troubles. The other members of their tour group were openly discussing whether they should find a different guide to avoid being associated with the incident. James maintained his position and bearing while keeping Margaret under observation, demonstrating the same discipline that had made him an exemplary guard now applied to civilian law enforcement. His fellow guards, while remaining in their ceremonial positions, showed subtle signs of pride and approval at how their colleague was handling this unprecedented situation. The Metropolitan Police vehicles arrived with lights flashing but sirens turned off out of respect for the ceremonial nature of the location. Two experienced officers emerged from the lead vehicle, immediately taking in the scene with the practiced eyes of professionals who had dealt with countless tourist incidents. Over the years, Constable Sarah Williams, a 15-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police, approached James first. She could see immediately that he was handling the situation with complete professionalism, and his military bearing commanded her immediate respect. "Constable Williams, Metropolitan Police. Can you give me a brief summary of what occurred here?" James responded with military precision, his account clear and factual. "Constable Williams, this woman physically assaulted me while I was performing my duties as a member of the Queen's Guard. The assault was witnessed by approximately 300 tourists, many of whom have video evidence of the incident. Palace security can provide additional witness testimony." Constable Williams nodded and turned to Margaret, who was now visibly trembling with a combination of fear and continued anger. "Ma'am, you're being detained for questioning regarding an alleged assault. You have the right to remain silent, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." Margaret's voice reached new heights of indignation. "This is a complete travesty of justice. I'm being persecuted for taking photographs. I want to contact the American Embassy immediately, and I demand to speak to whoever's in charge of this entire ridiculous situation." The second officer, Constable David Park, began collecting witness statements from the crowd of tourists. The consistency of their accounts was remarkable. Every witness described the same sequence of events, with Margaret's escalating aggression culminating in her deliberate physical assault on James. German tourists provided his video footage, which clearly showed Margaret pushing James after ignoring repeated warnings from security. "I have been filming since she first started causing problems," he explained to Constable Park. "The video shows everything that happened, including her refusing to follow the rules." Margaret overheard this and spun around with fury. "You had no right to film me without permission. I'll sue you for violating my privacy." But her threats only generated laughter from nearby tourists who understood that she had no expectation of privacy while committing crimes in public. Constable. Williams maintained her professional demeanor while explaining the situation to Margaret. Ma'am, assault is a serious offense in the United Kingdom, particularly when committed against a member of the armed forces performing official duties. The evidence against you appears to be substantial and well documented. I want a lawyer, Margaret demanded. I'm not saying another word until I have legal representation, and I want someone from the American embassy here immediately. James remained at attention throughout the police proceedings, his bearing serving as a stark contrast to Margaret's emotional breakdown. His handling of the crisis had transformed him from a ceremonial figure into a symbol of dignity and professional excellence that would be remembered by everyone present. The crowd of tourists began to disperse slightly as the immediate drama wound down. Many remained to watch the conclusion of the incident. Several approached James to express their admiration for how he had handled the situation, with one British veteran saluting him respectfully. As Margaret was prepared for transport to the police station, she made one final attempt to escape consequences for her actions. Wait. I can make a substantial donation to charity. I can pay damages to anyone who is affected. Money is no object. Just tell me what it will cost to make this disappear. Her desperate offer to buy her way out of legal accountability only served to further demonstrate her complete failure to understand the gravity of what she had done. Constable Williams shook her head with professional disappointment. Ma'am, this is now a criminal matter. It cannot be resolved with financial payments. The police vehicle doors closed on Margaret's continued protests and demands, finally bringing quiet back to the palace courtyard. James executed a perfect about-face and resumed his ceremonial position, though the crowd of tourists remained larger than usual, many of them taking respectful photographs and discussing the remarkable scene they had just witnessed. Robert Thompson approached James during a brief ceremony break. Guardsman Mitchell, I've been working palace security for 15 years. And I've never seen a situation handled with such perfect professionalism. You maintained your military bearing while effectively addressing a serious security threat. The incident had lasted less than 30 minutes, but its impact would extend far beyond Buckingham Palace. As videos of Margaret's behavior and James's response began spreading across social media platforms worldwide, generating millions of views and thousands of comments, praising the guards' handling of an impossible situation. What happened next shocked everyone in the courtyard. James suddenly broke his rigid stance and turned to face Margaret directly. His voice, when he finally spoke, was clear, authoritative, and carried the full weight of his military training. Ma'am, you have just committed assault on a member of Her Majesty's Guard, he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. I am placing you under citizen's arrest until the proper authorities can take you into custody. Margaret's mouth fell open in complete surprise. She had never expected the guard to speak, let alone take action against her. You can't be serious. It was just a little push. You're overreacting. I am completely serious, James replied firmly. Physical contact with a royal guard while on duty is considered assault under British law. You have been warned multiple times by security to maintain proper distance, and you chose to ignore those warnings. The crowd of tourists began murmuring excitedly, phones and cameras capturing every moment of this unprecedented scene. Many of them were recording Margaret's shocked expression as she realized the gravity of her situation. I want to speak to your supervisor, Margaret demanded, her voice rising to an almost hysterical pitch. I'm an American citizen, and you can't treat me this way. Do you know how much money I've spent in this country? James remained calm, but firm. Our nationality and spending habits are irrelevant when you break the law, ma'am. The security officer who warned you multiple times will serve as a witness to your behavior, as will dozens of tourists who recorded your actions. The security officer stepped forward, looking relieved that the situation was finally being handled properly. The police are already on their way, he informed James. They'll be here within minutes to take over. Margaret looked around frantically at the crowd of tourists, hoping to find support or sympathy, but she saw only disapproving faces and active phone cameras. She began to realize that her behavior had been not just inappropriate, but criminal. This is insane. All I did was try to take a picture. You people are treating me like I'm some kind of terrorist, she protested, but her voice lacked the confidence It had held just moments before. James stood at ease but maintained his authoritative presence. "Ma'am, you pushed a member of the Royal Guard. So that action constitutes assault. Your intentions regarding photography are irrelevant once you made physical contact without permission." The sound of approaching sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder by the moment. Margaret's face went pale as she began to understand that this wasn't just going to be an embarrassing moment she could laugh about later. She was actually going to face real consequences for her actions. 2 police officers arrived at the scene within minutes, their presence immediately commanding respect from the gathered crowd. They approached James first, who gave them a clear and professional account of what had transpired. "Officer, this woman physically assaulted me while I was performing my duties as a royal guard," James explained. "The security officer here witnessed the entire incident, and multiple tourists have recorded evidence of her behavior." The senior police officer nodded and turned to Margaret, who was now visibly shaking with a combination of anger and fear. "Ma'am, we need to hear your side of the story, but first, I must inform you that you're being detained for questioning regarding assault charges. This is completely unfair," Margaret burst out. "I barely touched him. He's making this into something." "It's not." But even as she spoke, she could see the damning evidence all around her, dozens of phone cameras that had captured her aggressive behavior and the moment she pushed the guard. The police officer remained professional but firm. "Ma'am, physical contact with any person without their consent constitutes assault. The fact that this occurred against a royal guard while on duty makes it particularly serious. You'll need to come with us to the station for processing." As the officers began to escort Margaret away, she made one last desperate attempt to avoid consequences. "Wait, I can pay a fine. How much do you want?" "I have money," but her offer only made her situation worse, as attempting to bribe police officers was another serious offense. The crowd of tourists watched in fascination as Margaret was led toward the police car. Many of them were still recording, and some were already uploading videos to social media with captions about the entitled American tourist who assaulted a royal guard. James resumed his position, though the formal ceremony had been disrupted. His fellow guards, who had maintained their positions throughout the entire incident, gave him subtle nods of approval. They all knew how difficult it was to deal with disrespectful tourists while maintaining military discipline. The security officer approached James during a brief break. "I've been working here for 8 years, and I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that so well. You showed remarkable restraint and professionalism." "Thank you, sir," James replied. "I hope this serves as a reminder to other visitors that we're not decorations or entertainment. We're soldiers doing our job, and we deserve the same respect as any other person." As Margaret sat in the back of the police car, she watched the tourists continuing to take pictures of the guards, but now with proper distance and respect. Her actions had inadvertently created a teaching moment about appropriate behavior and respect for others. At the police station, Margaret faced the full weight of British law. The assault charge was serious enough, but her behavior had been so publicly documented that there was no way to deny or minimize what she had done. The videos from tourists' phones showed clearly that she had ignored multiple warnings before physically confronting the guard. The desk sergeant informed her that assault on a royal guard could result in significant fines and even imprisonment.
"Oh, man."
Margaret's entitled attitude quickly crumbled as she realized this wasn't a situation her money or status could easily resolve. "I want to call the American embassy," she demanded, but was told that while she had that right, it wouldn't change the charges she was facing under British law. Meanwhile, the story of Margaret's behavior and James's response had gone viral on social media. Videos of the incident were being shared thousands of times, most comments praising the guard for his professionalism and condemning Margaret's disrespectful actions. James had returned to his duties, but news of his handling of the situation had reached his superiors. His commanding officer commended him for maintaining military bearing while appropriately addressing an assault situation. His actions had not only protected his own dignity, but had also reinforced respect for the institution he represented. The incident became a teaching moment at the palace. Security briefings now included Margaret's case as an example of how tourist behavior could escalate and what appropriate responses looked like. New signs were posted reminding visitors that the guards were active duty soldiers, deserving of respect, and that inappropriate behavior would result in legal consequences. Margaret eventually pleaded guilty to the assault charge to avoid a trial. She paid a substantial fine and was banned from all royal properties for 5 years. The legal fees, combined with the fine and her ruined reputation from the viral videos, made her London vacation extremely expensive in ways she never anticipated. Back home in New York, Margaret found that her social media accounts had been flooded with negative comments from people who had seen the videos. Her business associates distanced themselves from her. Embarrassed by her behavior and the negative publicity it brought, James continued his service with renewed pride, knowing that he had stood up for himself and his fellow guards in exactly the right way. The incident reinforced his belief that respect must be earned and maintained, and that sometimes standing up for yourself requires breaking from expected behavior. 3 months after the incident, that would forever change both their lives.
No.
Legal proceedings reached their conclusion in Westminster Magistrates' Court. The courtroom was packed with international media representatives, legal observers, and members of the public who had followed the case through its viral social media coverage. Margaret sat in the dock wearing a conservative black suit, a stark contrast to the designer outfit she had worn on that fateful morning at Buckingham Palace. District Judge Caroline Winters had presided over thousands of cases during her distinguished career, but few had generated such widespread public interest or represented such a clear example of entitled behavior meeting British justice. The evidence presented during the brief trial had been overwhelming and undeniable. Mrs. Whitfield, Judge Winters addressed Margaret directly, her voice carrying the authority of decades of legal experience. "You have pleaded guilty to assault against a member of Her Majesty's Guard, disorderly conduct, and attempting to bribe a police officer. These offenses, particularly when committed against a serving member of our armed forces, represent serious breaches of British law and public order." Margaret's face was pale and drawn, bearing little resemblance to the confident businesswoman who had arrived in London expecting special treatment and unlimited accommodation for her desires. The months of legal proceedings, public humiliation, and professional consequences had taken a visible toll on her physical appearance and mental state. The court has considered the exceptional video evidence provided by numerous witnesses, all of whom consistently described your pattern of escalating aggressive behavior despite repeated warnings from security personnel. Judge Winters continued. Your actions showed complete disregard for British law, military traditions, and basic human decency. The sentence that followed would serve as a landmark case for tourist behavior in the United Kingdom. Margaret was fined £15,000 for the assault, charged £5,000 for disorderly conduct, and an additional £10,000 for attempting to bribe police officers. Additionally, she was banned from all royal properties and ceremonial sites in the United Kingdom for 10 years in order to complete 200 hours of community service upon her return to the United States. Most significantly, Judge Winters imposed a 2-year suspended prison sentence, meaning that Margaret would face immediate incarceration if she committed any offense in the UK during that period. The suspended sentence sent a clear message that tourist misbehavior would be taken seriously by British courts regardless of the offender's wealth or nationality. The victim in this case, Guardsman Mitchell, displayed remarkable professionalism and restraint while performing his duties in service to the Crown, Judge Winters noted. His handling of your assault demonstrated the highest standards of military bearing and civil law enforcement. In contrast, your behavior represented everything that is wrong with entitled attitudes and disrespectful tourism.
Margaret's legal
fees had exceeded £75,000, and the reputational damage to her business was proving far more costly than the financial penalties. Multiple clients had terminated their contracts with her marketing firm, citing concerns about being associated with someone who had gained international notoriety for assaulting a British soldier. The viral videos of the incident had been viewed over 50 million times across various social media platforms, making Margaret's face recognizable to millions of people worldwide. Her behavior had become a cautionary tale shared by travel bloggers, etiquette experts, cultural commentators, as an example of how not to behave as a tourist. James Mitchell, meanwhile, had been promoted to Lance Corporal in recognition of his exceptional handling of the incident and his continued exemplary service. The promotion ceremony took place at Wellington Barracks, attended by his fellow guardsmen and senior military officers who had been impressed by his professionalism under extreme pressure. Lance Corporal Mitchell, his commanding officer, announced, "During the ceremony, your actions on that day in June demonstrated the finest qualities of a British soldier. You maintained perfect discipline while appropriately addressing a serious assault, bringing honor to yourself, your regiment, and the institution you serve." The incident had indeed become a teaching moment throughout the British tourism industry. Hotels, museums, historic sites updated their visitor briefings to include reminders about appropriate behavior and respect for local customs and institutions. The Margaret Whitfield case became shorthand for the consequences of entitled tourist behavior. Palace security protocols were enhanced based on lessons learned from the incident, but the primary change was cultural rather than procedural. Tourists now approached the guards with notably more respect, apparently having learned from Margaret's highly publicized mistakes that these were not decorative figures, but serving soldiers, deserving of dignity and appropriate distance. The royal family itself had been briefed on the incident, with sources indicating that they were pleased with how the situation had been handled by both the guard and the legal system. The monarchy's reputation for maintaining dignity while upholding appropriate consequences had been reinforced by the case's resolution. 6 months after the incident, Margaret attempted to rebuild her business and reputation back in New York, but the damage proved extensive and lasting. The viral nature of her behavior had created a permanent digital record that potential clients could easily discover. Her attempts to rebrand herself and minimize the incident were unsuccessful. As the videos continued to resurface whenever her name was mentioned, she was eventually forced to sell her marketing firm at a significant loss and relocate to a smaller city where she was less likely to be recognized. The woman who had once demanded special treatment and believed that money could solve any problem learned that some consequences cannot be purchased away or negotiated out of existence. James continued his distinguished military career, eventually being selected for additional ceremonial duties based on his proven ability to handle difficult situations with perfect military bearing. His response to Margaret's assault became a case study in military academies as an example of how to maintain discipline, while appropriately defending oneself and one's institution. The story became legendary among the guards themselves, passed down through generations of soldiers as a reminder that their service was meaningful and that they had the support of both their superiors and the British legal system when tourists crossed the line from annoying to criminal. Years later, when tourists visited Buckingham Palace and watched the changing of the guard ceremony, many would remember the story of the entitled American woman who learned that wealth and status meant nothing when faced with British justice and military dignity. The guards continued their ancient duties with renewed respect from visitors who understood that they were witnessing not a performance, but the dedication of serving soldiers protecting centuries of tradition. The incident served as a permanent reminder that respect is not something that can be demanded or purchased. It must be earned through appropriate behavior and genuine appreciation for others. Regardless of their role or station in life, Margaret Whitfield's fall from entitled tourist to an international symbol of inappropriate behavior became one of the most documented examples of how quickly privilege can turn into public humiliation when basic human decency is abandoned.